do something every day you know you'll fail at. And when you do that, you get this little inoculation effect, because then when big failures happen, ones you were not expecting and didn't put yourself in the way of, it's not important that you have failed. It's important that you witnessed yourself failing before. Because what that does is it creates the cognitive schema and the internal infrastructure for knowing how you deal with failure.
Welcome to Engage Presents. I'm Engage co-founder and president Jake Olson. In this interview series, I ask Engage talent the most common questions we hear from event planners to help you get to know them and their stories in 15 minutes or less. Thanks for listening. Welcome to another episode of Engage Presents. I am Engage president Jake Olson. Alongside me today is Dr. Brynn Winegard. Doctor, you are an impressive woman. You are an applied neuroscience and psychology, positive psychology expert. So hopefully we get an uplifting talk today. And you are going to be, an author coming up here, a new book coming out, The Working Brain. That's exciting. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. So lovely to meet you, Jake.
Yes, likewise. So as I mentioned, the book is going to be coming out. I think it might even be out by the time this is released. So give us maybe a sneak peek and maybe a little bit of a marketing ploy here for people to get that book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's true. So the book, which I think you might be able to see in the background, but I'll show as well, it will be out very soon. So it launches on December 3rd. And it's a double entendre. So it's called The Working Brain, and it's designed to be about how your brain is functional and operational, how it works, and dispelling some of the myths and misconceptions about that. But then it's also set in the context of the workplace and during the work day. And so what I look at is the applied neuroscience of people who are actually working, like real professionals, kind of doing what we consider to be not only everyone's job every day, but mundane, right? Like the context of work is kind of mundane, but no one had really looked at it before. And so that was part of the impetus, was to say, we've talked a lot about the leadership brain. We've talked about the ADHD brain, the addicted brain, the sleepless brain. We've not really talked about just how your brain operates every day as you go about doing the things that matter to you, so you can, feed your family and provide and do the things that make you you. And so that's really what the book is all about, is looking in those contexts, and then also saying, what are the myths and misconceptions? Because that was a real impetus for me, Jake, around why to in the original impetus to write the book, was to say, well, what are some of the myths and misconceptions that I see and that I hear reverberated back to me when I'm on stages? And so what, I found was so many times I would give a whole talk and people would come back to me and say, what about this? Or have you heard this? Or is this true? And what I started to realize was that not just mainstream media, popular culture, corporate lore had a lot of myths and misconceptions about the brain and how it works. And so people were not only not understanding it properly, they were also misusing their brain, if we can think of it like that, as their primary tool for work. They're not using it properly. And so that was kind of also the impetus, was to say, how do we dispel myths and misconceptions so that, people aren't harming themselves, and so that they are doing better for themselves each day, realizing better mental wellness, of course, that's part of the impetus. And then cognitive optimization was really otherwise the goal.
That is very interesting. I never really thought about it that way. Like, understanding how the brain works. It's crazy. I'm sure you can go down even a rabbit hole of even trying to explain how the brain doesn't know how itself works, but we don't have to get into that today. You mentioned that you were in corporate for, many years. You've spoken to many Fortune 500 companies, all these corporations. So, being at one point in your life, that person in the seat in the audience, what do you kind of find interesting about that crowd? And I know, obviously, we talked about the working brain, but you do have a lot of research-backed topics that kind of can apply to someone who's sitting in that chair. So kind of, tell us why that person in that chair, I guess, how they can specifically take away from your speaking topics.
Yeah, oh, great question. You're so right, Jake, is that I often do conceive of the people in the room as having been them, right? Like, absolutely.
Mm.
I think my favorite thing about those audience members is certainly how much we share in common. Definitely also is the curiosity and sort of the interest in continually and perpetually getting better and improving. And I notice that ubiquitously across the board. So, when you look at these big corporate companies or really successful organizations, even startups, that have amazing players on their team, they are still searching for answers to what makes what they can do to improve, to get better. And that's always inspiring, right? Like when
Mhm.
I get questions or when I see that light bulb go off in their eyes, and I know A, they've had a eureka moment, or B, they're eating it up like a sponge. That's just so inspiring to me. So I think it's a misnomer is that the person on the stage is the one who's the inspirer, because on the one hand we're doing our best, but on the other hand, I find I gain so much energy and insight and inspiration from the people in the room. And I often joke that, by the time a speaker is on the stage, we already know what we were going to say. We already had our whole talk planned out. So for us, it's like second nature, at least for me. And then what we're really doing up there is watching you, like the audience members, for what did they like? When did that eureka bulb go off in their mind? What are they responding to? What are they finding funny? What are they finding interesting? What are they kind of maybe not finding as interesting? And then on stage, I'm tacking and jiving to give them more of that so as to continue to try to bring out, more of what interests them. And the fact that they're interested and curious is really what I love the most about those audiences. And then to your question about like, what's in the book that can help them, there's a couple. So really it's two parts. The book's two parts. One of the first part is all about the ultradian rhythm, it's called, or the ultradian cycle. And it's actually, most of us have heard of the circadian cycle, which is like that day night, light dark, sleep wake cycle that happens in every person's body. It's actually not 24 hours long, it's 23 and a half hours long. But the idea is that it's a little bit shorter than we expected, but I'll tell you what's even shorter is the ultradian rhythm that your brain is on. And so in like the 1960s, sleep researcher Nathaniel Kleitman, he discovered that actually the brain's doing something different during the nighttime that is shorter than this 24-hour cycle. It's on its own cycle. And what he then figured out was that if that's happening while you're sleeping, what's happening during the day? And of course, that cycle perpetuates. It's not exactly the same. There are no REM cycles. You don't go into quite the same level of deep sleep and those delta waves that we see in like non-REM 3. But during the day, your brain is ebbing and flowing. And so the first half of the book is about that ultradian cycle and how to understand where you're at in what I call the rise, the peak, the fall, and the valley, right? Like just like a cycle that
Mhm.
continues. You're climbing up to your peak performance. You're at this peak at some point, feels great, you get a lot done. Then you fatigue, you have what we call like a refractory period, an ultradian stress response. I just call that the fall. And then there's this moment in the bottom, what I call the valley. We call that the ultradian healing response. It's typically about 20 minutes or so. And so that whole cycle permeates your whole day. And so your brain works different than your body, despite the fact they're inextricably linked. And so in that first half, I talk about how do you understand which phase you're in, and then what can you do to maximize each phase? So, as opposed to fighting against the ultradian stress response and trying to push through and power through and be macho or, risk burning out, instead, take a break, right? Like it doesn't have to be terribly sort of difficult. And then the other piece of that was that what those activities are that would maximize that phase. So, often people will say, well, yeah, sure, I take breaks every 90 minutes or so, but my breaks are, I'm on my mobile device, I'm scrolling, I'm snacking. Like there are a bunch of sort of no-nos. And then the question is, well, then what are the things that you should do? And it's not to snack and it's not to scroll. And, it is to try to wander through nature, get some fresh air, those types of insights for best practices for your brain's breaks. So what can you do? And then what we know is, as an example, and I say this often in different contexts, but the quality and the quality of your breaks and your rest and your restoration directly predict the quality of your uptime and your productivity and your output. And so people will often overlook, especially in corporate life, people will often overlook the value an importance of like a break and of downtime and of doing nothing, right? Because it feels so unproductive. And actually, that's directly predictive of how well you will do in your uptime. And so it's little things like that. And then the second half of the book is my proprietary framework called the Merit Framework, and which Merit stands for move, eat, rest, interact, and think. It's predicated on the pillars of lifestyle, preventative, mind-body medicine, which typically have 6 pillars. And it includes moving, of course. Typically in lifestyle medicine, no physician will tell you not to exercise. It includes nutrition, what to eat. Of course, it includes rest, but in their case, they refer to it as quality sleep. I include actually rest to include the valleys of the day. So, rest during your waking hours, as well as quality sleep. What lifestyle medicine misses typically is they talk sometimes about social support, but they don't talk tons about the value of human interaction. And so in that 4th pillar of the Merit Framework, I talk, and it's a really long chapter, all about the importance of interaction, in-person social interaction, especially in the office, especially when it comes to things like creativity, developing camaraderie, developing quality innovations that are successfully commercialized, creating a circumstance where your brain understands that you are socially supported, which is helpful for your mental health and wellness. And so that's that 4th pillar that I do talk a lot about. And then the 5th one is, again, sort of covered in the lifestyle pillars, but not as much. It's around the thinking and how your mindset, your mentality, the inner world that you create is so important for how your brain works and for how you do, for how, well you do, for how mentally well you do, for how cognitively optimized you are. It makes a difference. And people often underestimate that, right? Is this idea that, well, it doesn't really matter what I say to myself, and it doesn't really matter what's happening in there. That's concealed from public view. No one knows what's happening in there. That's fine. It can be, it can be whatever of a wreck it needs to be, as long as you're not showing the world. And that's a falsehood.
Right.
It's the idea that, it really matters what we allow ourselves to think, what we discipline ourselves to think, and then what we, how it is that we condition ourselves to treat our own selves, and then that inner world that we create that does establish our mindset and our wellness.
That is amazing. Lastly, just because that 5th pillar, I think so many people need that these days of just, I want you to give them just a concrete practices or tips that they can better themselves right now. It doesn't even have to be at a professional level, although I'm like, as you mentioned, it does translate, but give them just something to leave with today. Talk about that 5th pillar that they can go and love themselves better.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great one. I'll leave you with 2. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
There's 2, and the reason for that is because they're interrelated. So actually, some of my best advice, some of what especially is topical right now with work from home, with hybrid work models, is the idea that we are still a lot of people fighting to stay in their work from home environments, and big bag corporations calling them back to a hybrid model. Actually, there is a dangling carrot for individuals, according to the brain science, that you would want to go to work at least some days a week, because you get to interact with other humans. And the way the brain is still wired to work is that when it interacts with others, it conceptualizes and conceives physically and firsthand how well supported it is, and therefore how much social support you have, how much social capital. I talk about that in the book, how much social capital you have. And when you feel like you're socially supported, you have better mental health and wellness outcomes. And so that's the first, because you can't really think your way through chronic loneliness or social isolation. So the first thing is to prioritize in-person, face-to-face interactions, however and whenever possible. And then that leads into that's the 4th pillar. It leads into the 5th pillar, which is around, now once you've kind of mastered the other stuff, you're doing the right eating and sleeping and resting, and you're giving yourself adequate movement, and you're interacting with people and purposefully fostering relationships at work. That 5th one around mindset, I talk about basically, back in the day, a lot of corporate life, we heard about the growth mindsets, growth versus, fixed. And Carol Dweck released that book in 2006. And then along came Taleb, he's another theoretician, who said, well, there's this place even above growth, and it's called antifragility. And antifragility is exactly as it sounds. It's when you take strife or stress or strain, challenge, difficulty, and you don't just rebound from that. You actually get better. You allow it, you use it to, to actually kind of improve yourself. I think of it like cognitive jujitsu, kind of, right? Like you use the force from the aggressor or from the world in order to create your own action, not a reaction. And so it's really about going with the flow of the universe and saying, I'm not going to fight it. How can I materially use this energy? And so when you experience barriers or you experience obstacles or challenges, how can you use that as informative for your next move? And that implicitly then, Jake, what we understand is that you have to be nimble. You can't be too stuck or fixed or fragile, would be the opposite of anti-fragile. You can't be too fragile in your mindset or in how you want to approach something. We all have plans, we all have a vision, but the idea that if you're too stuck and you're too rigid about that, then you won't be able to tack and jive and move when there is, that force that comes to you in the way of obstacle or strain or stress or strife. You won't be able to move with that energy. You're going to try to counteract and countervail that energy. And so you have to be nimble. You do want to stay curious. You want to stay observant. You want to be situationally aware. You want to be not too tied to like the data and the metrics and the ideas that you had yesterday, because the ideas you'll have tomorrow will be new and different. And so that also implicitly, and I have like 20 or more of these types of examples, but it says to be anti-fragile, you then want to continually learn. You want to stay curious. You want to continue to try to, I talk about micro-dosing failure, but the idea that you're basically taking little bits of failure every day. Do something every day you'll fail at. And when you do that, you get this little inoculation effect, because then when big failures happen, ones you were not expecting and didn't put yourself in the way of, it's not important that you have failed. It's important that you witnessed yourself failing before. Because what that does is it creates the cognitive schema and the internal infrastructure for knowing how you deal with failure.
Dr. Brynn, I can tell you are just a well of knowledge and good ideas and tips and tricks. And I got to get this book. So I so appreciate you sharing just a little bit about it today with so much to take home. But we really appreciate you sharing again, and also just being on our platform, willing to share that knowledge and let us promote you. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Brynn, please visit letsengage.com. You can check out her profile, of course, book her. But thank you again, Doctor, and we cannot wait to read that book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jake. Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Stay tuned for more Engage Presents.